Hi there, it's Sharon Waxman, the editor-in-chief of TheWrap, coming to you from our Wrap studio at the Toronto Film Festival. Welcome to the cast and the director of Hearts and Bones, which is screening in the festival. So Ben, tell us the story of the film.
So the film is about a war photographer returning home, and he is approached by a South Sudanese man, played by Andrew Lurie, who he had photographed 20 years earlier. And the film becomes about a friendship that forms between the two men and the history they had during a war. And at the core of it, there's a mystery surrounding the photograph that was taken of this man in his village. And so it becomes about that, and it becomes about the friendship between the two men.
How did you research playing a war photographer who's already been through a great deal, who's witnessed a lot of trauma?
Ben and I talked a lot. We had a lot of conversations about particular photos that we liked, and then there was a hunt for finding particular photos that we were perhaps going to be using in the film, and we were able to get some wonderful photos and great photographers to provide their works for us. So I did a lot of sort of thinking about that, reading about that, about experiences of trauma in war and its experiences of photojournalists all around the world. And how many of them actually do suffer from PTSD is quite extraordinary.
I'm sure that's true. And then I'm sure they're also feeling guilty about having PTSD because, of course, what happens to the subject that they're photographing is worse than what's happened to them.
Yeah.
But you're still having to process all of this suffering.
And many of the subjects, of course, become, in their own right, quite iconic figures. If you think about the young Vietnamese girl after she's napalmed, there's a whole history to her, and she becomes a kind of key. Her life is changed not just by the war, but also by that photo.
Photo itself.
So all of the way in which the photographers necessarily go back to those places and key back into the lives of the subjects that they've been filming and how that affects them.
Yeah, I spent the first part of my career as a crisis zone reporter, and I worked really closely with photographers. And there's this kind of shield that goes up in the moment, right? Like first of all, photographers have to get very close, whereas reporters don't always have to be so close.
But even so, as a reporter, you'd still be suffering from things like that yourself. I mean, being in those sorts of zones, you'd be not only the people in actually combatants in a war zone are affected by it, but also obviously more civilians, and then the people reporting on it. So it's something which traumatizes everyone, I think.
It does, but my point was that it is actually, having worked with photographers, first of all, there's a whole breed of reporters who don't actually get close. Not the best ones.
And many do, and many lose their lives too.
And lose their lives.
Increasingly, reporters in those sort of zones, it's an increasingly difficult profession just politically to be a reporter anywhere in the world, even in your own country these days.
Sadly, that is true. So Ben, talk about where the story came from. Is this based on someone you know, or...?
The story's based on a lot of moments and research. I can draw it back to one particular moment as a campaign I did for Amnesty International, and I was working with a lot of recent refugees in Sydney. And one particular moment, I walked into a community hall and there was a group of Bosnian women who had formed a choir. And they sang a John Denver song, Country Road, Take Me Home. And the counterpoint of that song and those women and the introduction of each woman, we went through the group and they told me their name and where they were from. And just in that small moment, that small introduction, the emotion grew in the room, and by the end of it they were all in tears and supporting each other because of talking about who they were and where they were from. So it was a moment about identity and a collective healing around music, and that's a really important part of the film. And so I draw the story back to that moment, but war photographers that I've spoken to since then and other refugees and their experience, and setting it in a contemporary city, which could be anywhere in the world, was what I wanted for the film. So that's kind of where it came from.
Mm-hmm.